Hi, this is Adam Biek, and in this video we're going to cover a research paper that was done to look at what were the most effective interventions when it comes to trying to get rid of our panic disorder. So here I'm going to let you look on with me as I go through this study. Let me full screen this. The title is Dismantling Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Panic Disorder, a Systematic Review and Component Network Meta-Analysis. Basically, what they just did is went around to all the different researchers who have done studies on different interventions, and they asked them for data. Hey, can you give me the raw data? And they compared the raw data of different interventions in order to see which intervention was most effective. So let's look at the kind of interventions that they looked at. So here is a table of all the different interventions. So we have weighting component, placebo effect, psychological support, psychoeducation, breathing retraining, progressive applied muscle relaxation, cognitive restructuring, interoceptive exposure, in vivo exposure, virtual reality exposure, third wave components. And this one's interesting. I want to talk about that a little later. And face-to-face setting. So face-to-face setting is not exactly an intervention, right? Face-to-face setting just refers to the fact that the therapy was done with a provider. So it's also kind of a misnomer because it's not necessarily face-to-face, like, I went to his office so that we could have therapy. No, it could have been done by phone, could have been done by telehealth. The point is that it was not through self-help. Self-help is one thing, and with another person is another thing, right? So that's what face-to-face means. Let me quickly explain what all of these things mean, just in case they're not self-explanatory. So weighting component is people are made to wait. Nothing is given to them. They just have to wait. It's a nice way of comparing to see if we do nothing, what's going to happen, right? Placebo effect is we give you something that you think is going to help you, but we know it's not going to help you. So we want to see how much is you being convinced that you're being helped going to help you. Next one is psychological support. That's like if you come to a therapist and he just goes, and doesn't really tell you anything useful. So he just helps you allows you to vent, right? Psychoeducation. So I do a lot of that on this channel, actually. Psychoeducation is explaining to you what it is that you're going through and explaining to you like the methods and the theory behind how this stuff works, like the mechanisms behind it, and also how to get over what you're dealing with, right? So this is all psychoeducation. Breathing retraining. Breathing retraining, a lot of people who have panic disorder want to do breathing retraining. A lot of them just love breathing retraining. And not for a dumb reason. Like it's a good reason why people want that, but it's also misled. It's a misled reason. It's not the correct thing to do. So people really want to do breathing retraining because a lot of times when people have panic disorder, their breathing feels off. And so they start thinking that something's wrong with their breathing. But it's not. Actually, they're breathing excellent. They're breathing perfectly. If you have panic disorder and you think something's wrong with your breathing, let me tell you right now, you are breathing exactly as you should be breathing if you were to be this aroused. That's what it is. The breathing is different because there's a really, really high level of arousal going on, right? Arousal as in like fight or flight. So next one, let's go to the next one. Progressive muscle relaxation. It's a form of relaxation. It's when you relax one muscle at a time. It's when you leverage the natural muscle response. So whenever you flex a muscle really tight, let's say you make a fist, you flex it, and then you let go, your muscles automatically go into relaxation, like an exaggerated relaxation response. So that allows you to relax all of your musculature in your body. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, but not for panic attacks. It works for normal anxiety, just not for panic attack. Cognitive restructuring. This is cognitive restructuring. That's like the video I made. With the title of the video was, in order to cure your panic attacks, you have to question your fears. So cognitive restructuring is questioning your fears. It's when you question your fears. It's when you change your mind, right? So I phrased it as questioning your fears because that's kind of like the first step you take in order to change your mind about the things that you're so terrified of. So that's what cognitive restructuring is. Next one down is interoceptive exposure. So there's two different kinds of exposure. There's interoceptive exposure and there's I guess, the traditional exposure. The traditional exposure pertains to phobias, whereas interoceptive exposure pertains to panic disorder. I'll talk more about that later. So interoceptive is specific to panic disorder. In vivo exposure, that actually is more like the traditional exposure. It's a gradual exposure to real life situations that scare you. So that's more for phobias, right? So that's a little funny that this is included here in panic disorder. I'm not sure why. Maybe because a lot of times when people have panic disorder, they also have a comorbid phobia, one or two or three phobias. Virtual reality exposure is just another version of in vivo exposure. And third wave components, that's kind of like mindfulness. That's third wave components, that's mindfulness, that's Buddhist stuff, that's observing things non-judgmentally. Very interesting stuff. I'm going to talk more about this later, and also very useful. And the last one is face-to-face setting. So that's was the therapy delivered in with another person, with a therapist, or was it delivered through like a written format, self-help format, right? So it's not about going to somebody's office. You can do it by telehealth. You can do it by phone. So now let's look at what was some of the most effective things that they found to be. The most effective stuff they found was cognitive restructuring and interoceptive exposure. So okay, so now I think I explained a little bit what this was. Cognitive restructuring, that's cognitive behavioral interventions. They don't necessarily have to be cognitive behavioral interventions, not the traditional types. So the traditional types are looking at your cognitive distortions. So like cognitive distortions are, the errors we make, the mental errors that we make, they're logical errors that we make. Another way of doing cognitive restructuring is through Socratic questioning. So Socratic questioning is just a way of approaching a topic with a very curious mindset. So by being curious about something, you ask very good questions. They're very innocent questions, right? So they're not loaded, they're not biased questions. They're genuine questions aimed at trying to understand a situation. So by genuinely asking yourself questions about your own fears, whenever they are irrational, illogical, they fall apart under scrutiny, right? So that's why Socratic questioning is so useful. So that's what cognitive restructuring. Oh, another one more big example is adaptive responses. So adaptive responses is when you, let's say you have some sort of a fear and you say something to yourself about that fear. What is something else that you could say to yourself about that fear that could also be true? Perhaps that could be even more true, right? Alternative statements, alternative beliefs. That's what adaptive responses are. Now, interoceptive exposure, I made a video on both of these things actually, because I already know that these things are the most effective. So cognitive restructuring, that was the video where I said question your fears, and interoceptive exposure, I believe it just called it interoceptive exposure. Like something like if you don't do exposure, then you're never going to cure panic attack. I made it clickbaity. I'm sorry about that. But phobias are external, whereas panic disorder is internal. So when we do exposure for panic attack, so when we do exposure for phobias, we expose yourself to something scary outside of you. So maybe you're terrified of this soda can, right? You would get closer and closer to that soda can until you stop being afraid of it. So that's just traditional exposure. Interoceptive exposure is, let's say I have an ache here, and every time I feel an ache, I think I'm going to die of cancer, right? That is a great candidate for interoceptive exposure. I make myself pay attention to this spot until I stop freaking out about it, until I start realizing that I am actually safe, that everything's fine. So that's what it is. These things are the creme de la creme. They are very important, but there's one more thing. We're going to cover this a little bit later, and that's the third wave stuff. Let's now look at what was the least effective. The least effective was breathing retraining, muscle relaxation, and in vivo exposure and virtual reality exposure. Okay, so why were these things the least effective? Why was breathing retraining, muscle relaxation, why were they not effective? Okay, first, breathing retraining. We're going to get a little bit more into it later down in the paper, but a lot of people love breathing retraining. They think this is the way to go. You might, if your stats are correct, then you very well might think that breathing retraining is the way for you to go. It is not, I'm telling you. A lot of people who have panic disorder think there's something wrong with their breathing. Like they're either breathing too fast, not fast enough. They can't get enough air. Something's wrong with my breathing, right? No, nothing's wrong with your breathing whatsoever. Your breathing is actually on point. It's 100% correct. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing given what's happening inside of your body. What we have to do is fix what's happening inside of your body, well, inside of your mind, not what's inside, not what's happening with your breathing. Your breathing is A-okay. Treating your breathing is like treating a symptom, right? So a metaphor for this is like, let's say you have an itch, right? And you keep itching. Your hand keeps itching, your body keeps itching, and the real cause is that you keep washing your clothes in something that you're allergic to, right? But instead of changing what you wash your clothes in, not washing it in that detergent anymore, you start using a steroid cream to stop the itching. Silly, right? You wouldn't do that. Kind of the same thing with breathing retraining. It's a symptom. It's not the cause, right? Now, muscle relaxation exercises don't really work for panic disorder. They don't work. Enough said. In vivo exposure, that is more geared for phobias. It's not really geared for panic. In vivo exposure exposes us to the outside stuff, not inside stuff. So it's never going to fix panic disorder. So not surprising that doesn't work. Virtual reality exposure, again, virtual reality exposure is a type of in vivo exposure. It's a type of exposure to the outside stuff, right? So you put on a headset, you look at stuff that's supposed to scare you, right? That's a phobia. That's a phobic treatment. So they included some things in this study that are not directly targeting panic disorder. I suspect the reason why is that people don't really understand. Even scientists who study this stuff, they don't really understand how it works. Not many people understand how it works unless they lived it. I lived it. And that's why I have a much better understanding of why this stuff doesn't work, why these things work and how they work. Why do things work when they work? Why do things not work when they don't work? Because I lived it. I know exactly how this whole disorder functions. That's why I already know that this is like it's not even relevant. I mean, kind of is, because a lot of times people who have panic disorder, they will often develop comorbid phobias. They will develop phobias that co-occur with the panic disorder. So agoraphobia oftentimes coincides with panic disorder, but they can develop all other kinds of like situational phobias. So there is a place for some exposure work, but it's not going to cure panic disorder. It's not. All right, so now let's move on. Let me show you what they wrote right here. They wrote, our study also suggests that the better format for the administration of CBT is the face-to-face setting, which leads to a better outcome both in terms of response and remission. Furthermore, it also seems to improve patients' adherence to the treatment, reducing the number of dropouts. So, basically, when they write face-to-face setting, they're talking that you are talking to me by phone or by camera or face-to-face in person. Now, traditional face-to-face, meaning going to somebody's office, can actually be useful because that forces you to face a lot of the scary situations. So a lot of times people are phobic. So a lot of times people become afraid of having a panic attack out there in public, right? I'm afraid I'm going to faint somewhere in public. I'm afraid I'm going to get embarrassed in public. And just having to go to an appointment gives them an extra exposure opportunity. You know what I mean? So something else I wanted to point out to you is, here's something that they write. So results were favorable for third wave components, but with very large uncertainty. So the reason why they had a really large uncertainty is I believe somewhere else in the paper, I'm sorry, I didn't feel like looking for it. Somewhere else in the paper, they write that there was only one study that gave them data for their third wave interventions. So just as a recap, third wave interventions are the non-judgmental observation of your own symptoms. They were favorable, and I believe this is the edge where future of panic disorder treatment is going to go eventually, because third wave components, first of all, they are effective. And I'm telling you this as someone who understands how panic disorders function. They are effective. I weave third wave components into my interoceptive exposure protocol. I combine interoceptive exposure with third wave components with a non-judgmental attitude. And at the very end, I add a surrender component to it. I mix it all in there because it helps. It helps introduce you to the concept of surrender. And a lot of people are able to take that and generalize it to a full surrender, right? I believe that eventually they're going to start looking more into it, and they're going to start finding that this concept of surrender, this concept of non-judgmental observation, the mindfulness observation, Gestalt way of approaching or making contact with your own body, consciously observing your body. These techniques are possibly superior to the traditional exposure. Not necessarily. They don't have to be superior, but there could be just another way to skin the cat, right? So it's nice to be able to, if I have somebody in office with me, right? It's nice to be able to approach the same issue from many different angles, because not every approach helps everybody. The thing about surrender, and this is something that they didn't study here, because surrender is, well, it's going to be hard to standardize a philosophical, a cognitive, not even cognitive, a attitudinal, an attitude. It's hard to standardize helping you change your attitude. Maybe that's why this was never studied yet, or maybe scientists don't really know about this concept, about how useful and powerful it can be in getting rid of your panic attacks. So that concludes this study. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it interesting. Subscribe, hit the like button, share this content, and I will see you in the next video.